In our last segment, we learned about how the tensions between the Middle East powers begin to thaw and peace actually becomes possible. In the late 1970s, Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat make peace at Camp David. As a part of the deal for peace, called for peace between the two countries, Israel withdrawing from the Sinai Peninsula in stages to be completed within 3 years. It called for further meetings to resolve the Palestinian question. The meetings would have to include Jordan and a representative of the Palestinian people, and it called for a 5-year transitional period of Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank and Gaza. This transitional period would include the introduction of Palestinian self-government. Israel offers the Egyptians the return of the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza to their full control. The Egyptians accept Sinai but do not want to have control over Gaza. Funny enough, their peace agreement calls for the Palestinian state to be created in Gaza, and yet had they accepted the control of Gaza themselves, they could have easily established their own Palestinian state within Gaza with full self-governance. In a similar move, King Hussein of Jordan in 1988 indicated that in his recognition of the increasing authority of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, as a representative of a national ambition of the Palestinian people, Jordan would cede administrative control over the West Bank. With this announcement, an estimated 1.5 million Palestinian Jordanians instantly lost their citizenship and became stateless Palestinians living under Israeli control, rather than Jordanians as they were a day earlier. In 1994, Israel and Jordan also signed a peace treaty. Many of the key points surrounding mutual security, water, peace, and to discuss Palestinian refugees in a 4-way committee, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinians, to try and work towards a solution. Again, like Egypt, Jordan did not want to take control over the Palestinian territories or give any Palestinian rights. This left many Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza under control of Israel because Arab nations that once ruled over them wanted to use their plight and the Arab people living in Gaza and West Bank as a weapon against Israel, rather than take control over these regions themselves and make a state of their own for the Palestinian people. The growing anger of the Palestinian people leads to growing terrorism. Palestinian leaders and terrorists begin in Jordan with attempting to kill the King of Jordan in the 1970s. Palestinian terrorist groups involved themselves in Iraq and Syria. Palestinian terrorist leadership also involved themselves in the Lebanese War in the 1970s. The 1980s saw a transition from Palestinians attacking Arab nations and turn their attention to attacking Israel and Israeli citizens. The first Intifada began and suicide bombers attempted to harm Israeli citizens and civilian targets like stores, public transportation, and restaurants. The Intifada lasted until the signing of the Oslo Accord in the 1990s. The Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinian terrorist group PLO, later to be known as the Palestinian Authority, became the figurehead of the Palestinian people. The Oslo Accords declare that Israel should withdraw from Jericho and Gaza and eventually from the West Bank. In 5 years, have limited autonomy over the Palestinians in those areas, having elections of a Palestinian Legislative Council within 9 months, establish a Palestinian police force, and to later discuss the issue of Jerusalem. As part of facilitating this agreement between the Israelis and the Palestinian leadership, the Israelis implement different zones in the West Bank. This situation is still the law of the land today. The area known as Area A is under full civil and security control by the Palestinian Authority, the new name of the former Palestinian Liberation Organization group, who made the deal with the Israelis originally. This accounts for roughly 18% of the West Bank. This fulfilled the agreement that the Palestinians would have full autonomy, an established Palestinian police force, and Palestinian elected officials. In fact, Israeli citizens are even forbidden from entering this area, as it is not under the control of the State of Israel. The area known as Area B, this is an area that's under civil control by the Palestinian Authority, but a joint Israeli-Palestinian security control. This area accounts for about 22% of the West Bank. The area known as Area C is an area under Israeli civil and security control. This makes up about 60% of the remaining West Bank. These areas are filled with mixed Arab and Jewish settlements, with a plan to eventually establish official borders through land swaps, although the process has stalled for the most part. This is where we are today, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the supposed apartheid in the West Bank. We'll be right back on the Jewish Diaspora Report.